Good morning, everyone. My name is Darren Lamb. I'm the head of maths at GL Assessment, and I would like to welcome everyone to this webinar focusing on closing the language gap. Thank you to all of you. We've had close to 1,000 people sign up today. Not quite on the scale of Joe Wicks's PE lessons, but we won't work you as hard as he does either. This will be a first in a mini series of reading webinars to hopefully provide you with key practical insights and support in your schools, trusts and localities. We're planning our next webinar for May, when that will involve whole education and Bolton local authority as well, so please watch out for that on our website. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all and everyone in our education system who are working extremely hard in very difficult circumstances right now to teach and inspire young people remotely and also ensure our vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils remain looked after. Your efforts are greatly appreciated. It is widely acknowledged that skilled reading, writing and talking is crucial for students to succeed in school, particularly with the increased literacy demand with the latest GCSEs, and also statistics telling us that 25% of pupils at the age of 15 have a reading age of 12. Reading has never been so important. We at GL Assessment are working with a number of local authorities, academy trusts and research projects across the country on this very issue, and recently published a report, Read All About It, to highlight the scale of this challenge. If you haven't seen it already, we'll send you a link after the webinar. In the next 45-50 minutes or so, we will hear how these challenges around literacy have been faced by the students and teachers in Blackpool over a number of years. As a result, the Key Stage 3 Literacy Project was set up as a key focus within the opportunity area. We have been honoured to be one of many partners working with Stephen Tierney, Right to Succeed, the DFE, Blackpool Local Authority, 8 of Blackpool secondary schools and their PRU, and now the primary schools too. We recognise the hard work and dedication so many different people and organisations in Blackpool have put in collectively to improve outcomes for their young people. In today's session, I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Tierney, leader of the Key Stage 3 Literacy Project, previously CEO of Blessed Edward Bamber Catholic MAT and current chair of the Head Teachers Roundtable, and Bernadette Kaye, project lead and assistant head teacher at South Shore Academy. They're going to give their insights in how they've been working to help improve this vitally important master skill. We will save 10 minutes at the end for questions, which we will take from the chat box through the webinar. With so many people attending, we will only be able to pull out a few questions, but we'll try to respond afterwards to as many as possible. Please do tweet using our Twitter hashtag #WhyReading. Stephen and Bernie, thank you so much again for putting this together today, and I'd like to hand over now to Stephen.
Thanks, Darren. Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm coming in now loud and clear. So just a kind of a little bit of context around Blackpool, in so much as Blackpool was identified as the most deprived local authority within England. And to kind of put that in a little bit of context, there's something called geographical areas. They're called lower layer super output areas, and there's about 35,000 of these across England. 8 of the 10 most deprived are in Blackpool, and so it becomes an extreme outlier. And so challenges we're facing: too many children start school well behind age expected development, poor speech language communication skills, limited vocabulary and limited life experience. And then issues that many of you will be familiar with if you're living in areas of high poverty, domestic violence, substance misuse, poor mental health, transient overcrowding, and just the daily struggle to put food on the table. And so one of the kind of challenges that we faced was identified early, and it was just really in discussions with heads of department. And one of them, one of the themes that was identified across a whole series of discussions in September 2017 was around poor attainment and progress at GCSE across a range of literacy-based subjects. So English being key examples, but history, geography, RE, including into science and maths. We had a particular issue because there's a large number of white disadvantaged boys. Analysis of Key Stage 2 reading data showed that comprehension inference in particular was a weakness. And a lot of the pupils had poor sentence and kind of paragraph comprehension, decoding skills and limited fluency. So we kind of were looking at what was really underpinning this as a major challenge for us in terms of giving these pupils chances in life that others had. And so the issue of reading became paramount. And the kind of the genesis, the root of this project was in work that started within the trust. So it's useful to kind of look at that, and then I'll start to scale it up. So we set out September 17 with this idea that every child had to be reading at or above their chronological age, and started what I describe as an iterative process, because one of the things that if you're leading projects, school improvement projects, either within schools or across schools or within an area, is you need to start kind of almost preparing staff for major changes so that they can kind of really comprehend why it's doing. So from a very simple, and it'd be kind of like almost a 5-minute presentation to staff, right? We're seeing 3 big issues, and the 3 big issues, one was reading, the other was kind of revision retrieval for our pupils, and then the other was resilience. When the going got tough, they tended to fall over. And we just kept asking the question, is that right? Is that right? Is this what the problems are that are underpinning the lack of success for many of them? And we also, interestingly, started getting staff reading. And so 2 books, The Reading Mind, that was Daniel Willingham, and Closing the Vocab Gap, and that was Alex Quigley. We bought for any member of staff who wanted it. And then a month later, just sat down in a large group. In fact, the groups were so large, we broke into a couple and just chatted about the book and what we were learning. And by about March 2018, there was significant interest from the Opportunity Area Board. And so we started to actually scale the project because they wanted to see if the project could actually function across Blackpool. So around about March 2018, we scaled the whole Key Stage 3 literacy approach, which, as I said, had its genesis in the work done in the Trust, into across Blackpool. And what we're actually saying is that we can see 6 key issues from a project level that we think is worth spending some time on. And so I'm just going to kind of work my way through these over the next kind of 20 minutes and give people a flavour of the project. So number 1, right at the beginning of the project, within the Trust as a CEO, I was leading it. And that morphed into leading the project across Blackpool. And the need for a leader and a person who can actually make decisions became of paramount importance as you just start to make decisions. So which schools want to be involved, which year groups, which aspects of literacy? And they were all decisions that needed to be made as we were forming the plan for the project. And then there's things about to what extent are we going to make adjustments to the project during the course of it? And to what extent are we going to stick with the original plan? And I'll give you an example of that. So you can kind of frame it a little bit later on. But one of the key things I would say is that actually you need the leader in place 9 to 12 months in advance of starting a major initiative. And that doesn't happen often enough. And the planning phase is so often weak. And that weakness undermines the whole project itself. So the project that started September 17 really went wider in Blackpool about March 2018. And the sign off of the plan was around May 2018, which gave 4 or 5 months even prior to putting it in place to do further work on it. The kind of the next screen I'm going to show you, I describe this as a wallpaper slide. I'll tweet out afterwards a link to, I think it's called the 3 R's for Disadvantaged Children, which will take you to a site where you can download it. But what I'm going to play with here is the idea of beginning to develop a logic model. And those people who are familiar with the EF implementation guidance will have seen this kind of plan before. And what we're trying to work through is a series of questions which really says, so what's the problem? What are the problems that we're trying to solve? And if these are the problems, what might be the best ways to try and actually address them? And then how might we actually implement that? And then beginning to look through some of the outcomes. Now, I've talked already about that kind of poor attainment to GCSE, the lack of comprehension for pupils coming into secondary, the lack of kind of fluency, limited decoding skills for some, but also that very variable reading culture that our pupils have. But here there's two key issues that we need to pick up and just be honest about for the staff. One was there was a limited ownership of literacy. So the danger is when you talk about literacy across the curriculum, it becomes nobody's responsibility instead of everybody's responsibility. And part of that, don't underestimate just how limited teacher knowledge and understanding of teaching literacy is. There's a real fear factor. And so what we found as a project has gone on is teachers are really happy to engage with the teaching of literacy. And in our case, we looked at reading first, if they actually understand what it is you want them to do. And so that's key. But also in terms of the kind of the intervention descriptions we started talking about. So there was something about decoding and fluency. So we needed our pupils to develop fluency. So that's one approach. One of the things is around vocabulary. And what we kind of quite often see in primary schools is when it comes to the end of phonics, there's not a massive gap between more advantaged and disadvantaged students in terms of their attainment. But post phonics, the issue of vocabulary becomes really quite powerful and a differentiator, as well as so does what would be called cultural literacy, being able to understand texts within context. Part of getting good reading is practice. You just need to read more. So that became a key element. Whole staff training, and then beginning to look at consistent approaches to text and building capacity became very, very important. So this whole area about making sure you've got somebody who is going to lead the project and guide this planning phase through and then the implementation was important. And it wasn't something that I did alone. To be honest, my knowledge of literacy at the beginning of this project fitted on the back of a postage stamp. It was not an area that I was particularly knowledgeable or skilled in. But Philip accordingly was brilliant. For the cost of a lunch, she talked us through different kinds of approaches and thoughts. And so along with Philippa, there was Right to Succeed, there was Lexonic, there was GL, and all of these partners came together and helped form the project. And one of the early kind of wins was around Lexonic, which is a kind of a sound training, you might know them of, and it's a vocab program. And one of the things that we're learning from the actual project itself is what is scalable. So some interventions we found relatively easy to scale across. Others we've actually struggled with. The Lexonic one was an example of what we found easier to scale. And so Bernie might talk a little bit more about the accelerated reader literary canon approach. And again, they're different approaches to getting pupils reading more. Some are easier than others. So that project team and wrapping people around became important. And Alex Quigley joined us a little bit later on, but also became key within that. One of the things I talk about is building in evaluation from the outset. And one of the things I'm going to suggest is that large projects, large school improvement projects and initiatives, there is a systemic failure to actually build an evaluation. So at the end of projects, we don't actually know whether they've worked because we've never put metrics in place to find out. So we end up with anecdotes, quite often the person leading saying it was great, but we don't really know. And as daft as it sounds, we were actually prepared to find out that a lot of what we were doing didn't matter. We saw that as key to this kind of learning about what we should take forward. But also part of the evaluation schedule that we set out included fidelity checks. And so, for example, I mentioned Lexonic. If a member of staff was doing a Lexonic session, what should it look like? And then we got people observing it and actually saying, did we put in place that which we said we'd put in place? And just one kind of an aside here, we actually use GL past data as well. So as well as all pupils doing the the new group reading test, which we'll look at in a moment, we also used their pupil attitude to school and self, because we were interested whether improvements in literacy might have a correlation, and we'd see improvements in terms of the attitude of these pupils to school and self. And interesting, that data now, we've collected it once, but it's being used in multiple projects. So here's just kind of a couple of examples of the NGRT reading test and how we actually used it. So on the screen at the minute, you've got what is a standard graph that would be produced by GL for us. It's based upon standard nines, stay nines, and that is where a population is split into 9 groups. And you'll see that kind of magenta coloured line going across the graph, which is the bell-shaped normal distribution. That's the national average. And this is a year 7 group, and their standard age score is 98.8, which is broadly average, 100 being the exact average. The interesting thing I want you to look at here is, can you look over towards the left-hand side of the graph, where you can see a bar, which is stay 9-1 of boys and girls, which is described as very low, so a standard age score below 74. Nationally, you would expect about 4% of pupils to be in that stay 9. In Blackpool, it was 2.5 times this, and that was consistent across the overall project, but actually varied slightly from one school to the next. In some cases, actually varied quite a lot. And one of the things that we picked out early on in the data and had to make a decision about is what we call the Stay 9-1 challenge. And so to give you an example, this is from a school where about 10% of the population, as opposed to 4% nationally, are in it. When we looked at Ed Diversity, the pupil referral unit, they had 53% of their pupils in Stay 9-1 and Stay 9-2, 31% in Stay 9-1. And that kind of gives us, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. Did the poor behaviour mean pupils didn't access the learning, or could pupils not access the learning or the curriculum? And after a bit, their poor behaviour led to them moving into the PRU. And that challenge in the project is, should we stop what we'd proposed to do because we had such a large number of pupils within Stay 9-1? And the decision overall was that we decided not to, because we still had 80-90% of pupils to work with. But that prevents a real challenge. So that particular graph is from September 18, and it's year 7 in one school. Now, if we go to July 19, this is the same group of pupils. And what I want you to look at is, can you see the yellow dotted line and how, if you like, the pupil population has shifted to the right? In other words, it's shifted to higher level stay nines. And in terms of the data, the shift was from an average of 98.8 to 102.6. So using the new group reading test, we could see that we were beginning to have some kind of impact, because pupils had gone from broadly in line to significantly above. And in that school, we saw the same for year 8. They moved from 100.9 broadly in line to 103.1, which was again significantly above. And by the end of the first year, we saw that in 4 Blackpool schools, significant shifts to kind of higher scores on the new group reading test. And 3 schools stayed the same and 1 fell back. And what was interesting about the 1 that fell back is that we knew they had struggled to implement. Their problems around the senior lead, desperately wanted to stay in the programme, could see the value, but we just had to buy them time. And this is where GL assessment became invaluable, because not only their ability to provide the tests and crunch the data for us, but their understanding and ability to manipulate for it became really quite noticeable. And so that became a really important point. And just to touch base, have we got the evaluation in place? Will we know whether we're having some kind of impact? Not necessarily causation, that's much more difficult to do, But if we can produce some correlations, that might satisfy us and be well beyond what we would normally actually produce. Now, none of this happened by accident. And you're going to hear from Bernie shortly about one of the project leads. But this brings me to the issue of the capacity needed within organisations. So the project itself is just under £1 million over the 2 years. That's the level of funding required, 937,000, of which 470,000 was spent on school staffing. And what we said to each school who wanted to be part of the project is that they had to almost second for 2 days a week a senior leader to the project, and that the project itself would fund that. So each school received over the 2 years about £50,000 to release a senior leader. Had to be a senior leader because it had to be somebody who could operate at a whole school level. And the senior leaders, and we had job descriptions for them, there were 2 a day each. One was around the literacy lead, and one was about what we described as the evidence-informed lead. And so I'll return to kind of the evidence-informed lead in a minute and what their role was. The literacy lead is a bit like Ron Seal. It did what it said on the table. Some schools appointed 2 people for a day each. Other schools combined the role for the 2 people into one. But one of the things that's you need to think about when you're putting this level of project in is quite often people are happy to spend a lot of money engaging consultants, external companies to do work with schools, but too little thought is given to the organisations themselves and whether they'll have the capacity to actually implement. And quite often the answer is no, they don't. And so there's a place where the project can fail just through a lack of thought and planning. Now, the other way of actually generating capacity is, as well as putting more resource in, it's using the resource in schools more effectively. So one of the things that we actually had around the evidence-informed lead was them beginning to change the way schools are working and to stop what I describe as the kitchen sink approach to school improvement. You know, that approach where you just find something and you just keep lobbing it at school improvement and hoping it'll get better, and then everybody falls down exhausted. And the role of the evidence-informed lead was to challenge the senior leadership team, the school as a whole, about all the different measures they had in place, and to say to them, are these really having impact? How do we know? And critically, determining points at which you just stopped and said, look, we don't know whether this is having impact. It's taking a lot of resource. Let's actually stop this and spend our time implementing other things better. In terms of the professional development for those senior leads, this was actually massive. And one of the things I'd say just very, very clearly is there is no substantive curriculum development, whether it's literacy or anything else, without substantial professional development. And we identified all these things I'm talking to you about at a very early stage within the logic model. So we're very fortunate. We had people like Alex Quigley, who led on the Education Endowment Foundation, and he combined a leading learning and literacy program. And that was a 5-day program across the first year. We had Simon Cox, who leads the research school at St Mary's, and he led a 5-day program for evidence-informed leads, which combined the research lead and the implementation guidance, and he was supported by Phil Naylor. We have Philippa Cordingley from Cure, who did the response to intervention approach that I think Bernie's going to chat about later. And in the second year, we've had David Weston and the Teacher Development Trust, who has led professional development on leading professional development. Because one of the key things these senior leaders were doing is they were leading substantial professional development within their own organisations. And that was part of the commitment in. So final thought for you is the project won't run itself. And I think too often, and I suppose I'm reflecting on my own experience, we've kind of implemented something and then thought, oh, this will just happen. And projects don't. And just a massive thank you to Right to Succeed, Graham Duncan, and in particular Paul O'Neill, who's been the project manager in here across Blackpool. And so he's been meeting with all the subject leads, the senior leads on a fortnightly, monthly approach, as well as touching base at the professional development days, and we have whole group meetings as well. And one of the things that he would do is he would identify common issues early, and sometimes there were things we hadn't seen. So prior to starting the program in the June-July, we did a lot of training so that people could actually deliver the electronic program I've mentioned a couple of times. What we hadn't seen is the turbulence of support staff in Blackpool, which meant that by the middle of the year, Paul's coming back to me saying we need more training. And I'm saying, why? What's happened? And well, the standard things in life happen. Some people had got ill. Maybe some people had gone on to maternity. Other people had got new jobs within the school or new jobs in other schools. And so all of a sudden, where we thought we had lots of people training, we needed to actually do additional training. And so Paul picked up that very early. He does some great comm stuff. So there's weekly updates that come out via his little team to keep everybody on track. Very simple things about if we're putting things on, we need sign up, we need rooms and all that sorted out. And that's supporting people to stay on track. So there's kind of key milestones and key things that have to happen. And so Paul's in communication with all the senior leads. So when we need the GL assessments, he's 5 or 6 months, he's thinking ahead. He's saying, okay, when's the assessment window? We identify the assessment window. So the assessments have to be done. New group reading days pass. We're using the English progress test as well as maths and science are being done. So he puts in place the assessment windows, makes sure everything's in place. And finally, he does what I describe as spreading wisdom. So he'll go into various schools and see some really cracking practice. And just in a conversation, he can offer that to other people. And so we started the project, and it started from this idea of every child reading at or above the chronological age. I think we've moved on in our terms of our own thinking quite significantly. And we're seeing this now as a project where there are massive moral dilemmas and dimensions to it. And so we're now talking about enhancing pupils' life chances, supporting young people out of poverty, enabling them to live longer, happier, and more productive lives, breaking that cycle of intergenerational literacy. The reading programme has become so powerful across Blackpool in the 18 months that it's been implemented within the schools, that it's now beginning to gain a momentum which will take forward into a third year and beyond. So I hope that's been useful in terms of a major project overview. And I'm going to pass over now to Bernie, who's going to take you through some more specific examples.
So just before you start, Bernie, slight technical issue in that the host has been booted out of the session. So Stephen, can I just ask you if you could find Bernadette in the panelists list?
Oh, now we're in trouble.
If this doesn't work, I've got a backup plan.
I found Bernie.
If you can right click on her.
Yep.
And change the role to presenter. Do
you want to change? Yep.
Okay, Bernie, you should be able to go now and move through the slides.
Hi everyone. Suddenly my nightmares just became a reality then. Good morning everyone. So just to introduce myself, my name is Bernadette Kaye. Obviously I was appointed 2 years ago to be the Literacy and Evidence Informed Project Lead at South Shore Academy. That role has involved researching appropriate interventions, implementing GL assessment across the school, monitoring the data that's been brought in and ensuring appropriate provisions are in place for our students. And that's been a really exciting role, and one that, as Stephen mentioned, has been substantiated by quite significant professional development. I think what I've tried to do over the last 2 years is make sure that I'm sharing that learning as I go along, and I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, but I hope to draw some of those out as we go along today. So at the beginning of the project, Stephen mentioned we did a huge scale baseline assessment, not only of the new group reading test, but also assessments like the progress test in English, the progress test in maths and science, and obviously the pupil attitude to self and school survey. Now, when the data was generated. I remember being in a room with many senior leaders across Blackpool, and I remember hearing the gasps when my school's data was put on the screen. I'm just showing you a diagram now of the kind of the kind of curve generated at my school with the new group reading test, and you can see such an overwhelming percentage of students at the bottom end of the Stay Nines. We had 24% of students in Stay 9-1, and I do want to note that we're not a special school. We're not kind of a pupil referral unit. We are an ordinary comprehensive school with huge numbers of students in that bottom end. And yeah, senior leaders gasped on that day. And to be honest with you, I genuinely thought that this project was going to be beyond me. I didn't really know what I was going to do, and I had to have a lot of time to just kind of soul search with this information. People have asked me since, did you not know it? Did you not already know that this was a problem in your school? And to be honest with you, we probably did, but I think we didn't whole school reading age test our students. We only did it with certain populations of students. So we didn't really have that huge overview. So once we'd received this data, I pretty much felt like an outlier in Blackpool. I think a lot of the interventions that some teachers were selecting weren't going to be right for our school and our clientele, because we had such different needs. I think losing direction was a major point in my learning, but I think the data helped me to refocus and gather some momentum. Actually, the data's really helped to motivate our staff to change, because I think it gave such a moral purpose to the work we did in our school. So senior leaders across Blackpool were encouraged to select interventions appropriate for their cohorts. And as mentioned earlier, I wasn't really able to do much of what other schools were doing. Accelerated Reader was one programme that we were encouraged to kind of look at. And I think I will talk about the context of my school shortly. We were a new building. We had absolutely no books in the building. Very much one of the schools that kind of throws away the books when you move into a new building. And we had a huge lack of infrastructure for reading. And I think Accelerated Reader for me is a wonderful thing, but it requires a lot of student independence, autonomy, resilience. And we knew from our reading age data that wasn't going to work. And we had to do something different. We definitely had to ensure that literacy was part of a Quality First teaching programme, and that middle level leaders, SLT and governors were all driving literacy through the curriculum and not just relying on an intervention. So when I received the data from a whole school level, I realised that it was such a wonderfully powerful piece of information, and that the staff really needed to know how to use it. So the very first thing that I did was to make sure that GL came into the school, and they basically did a training session on all of the lingo regarding assessment. So our staff were trained on things like Stay Nines and standard age scores. We kind of linked that back to the Key Stage 2 idea that students were coming in from Key Stage 2 with standard age scores. So our SIMS mark sheets included the NGRT. It included data generated from the progress tests in English, Maths and Science. So our staff had a real wealth of information, not just in core, but in other subjects too. So each member of staff on their mark sheets for every class, they have the full wealth of data there. And we were very much interested in the so what of data. So what next? Yes, data is a wonderful thing. So what happens next? So I think the challenge we originally started off with, this is a picture of our library or resource base or whatever you want to call it. And I think this for me was a metaphor of the challenge I faced initially regarding literacy. If this is your learning resource base, your library, you can see that there was absolutely nothing that would promote literacy. It was a completely invisible culture. Actually, staff originally, they weren't really aligned to any kind of promotion of literacy. So we had a huge body of work to do there. Students' attitudes to learning weren't great. They didn't value reading. And actually, I worked in a school that was going through quite turbulent times. We were in special measures. We had incredible budget restraints and also time restraints. Although I was appointed to be the leader on this project, you know, I teach English and I was pulled in that direction as well. So it was a really challenging time. So we had to make something out of very, very little. So I decided, right, well, I can't do everything. Rome wasn't built in a day, and less is actually more. I remember Alex Quigley once using this bowling ball analogy, and if you had one thing and you could knock down a lot of balls, what would that one thing be? And that kind of stuck in my head quite considerably, and I decided very early on that quality first teaching was going to be the thing. So before I started the literacy project, through the EEF training, we were encouraged to do pre-mortem tasks. So think about, if you are doing a project, what could go wrong, and make sure that you've got kind of plans in place to minimise the things that can go wrong. Prioritising actions that suited my school was really, really important, and formulating a team, a literacy team. One person was never going to do literacy, and it became very, very clear early on that your middle level leaders are absolutely vital in the development of literacy. So for 2 years, my staff at South Shore Academy have had mainly literacy related CPD. We've had CPD on vocabulary, CPD on reading, using a lot of kind of the reading mind that Stephen talked about earlier. And it's been an iterative process. We've been revisiting things. We've had reciprocal read training once. We're going to do it another day on reciprocal read training at the back end of this year. And pretty much the key learning was that you have to give it heart with staff. You have to continually remind them of the data and the why we are doing this, because whole school change is tricky and people can lose focus. So keeping coming back to the data and the why we are doing it is really important. I also realised that we have to make it so simple it can't go wrong. So I'll talk a little bit about form time reading shortly, and I'll talk about an example of that. I also made sure quite early on that I was going to future-proof anything that I spent money on. So, for example, we have bought a large number of books for Register and Read, which is our version of a literary canon in form time reading. Every book that I've paid for in the last 2 years has been barcoded with accelerated reader barcodes, because although that intervention wasn't right for us at the beginning of the project, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be right for us forever. And it's really important that we do allow such a lot of money have been spent on this project that we should be allowing for projects to evolve. So the 3 priorities I've talked about this year, the 3 that I wanted to work on were explicit teaching of vocabulary, developing reading for pleasure and success, and encouraging academic reading. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I had to ensure that staff were doing this. We've done these 3 things for the last 2 years now. I'm reluctant actually to let go of them going into next year, because I don't really feel like we've boxed everything off yet. And I think that long-term vision is really important, because actually things don't just happen overnight, and it's really important to make sure that you give time to allow things to pan out. So I'm going to go through these 3 things now as the presentation continues. The first thing that we did was ensure that all staff were, as part of the Quality First teaching framework, all staff were ensuring that they were pre-teaching vocabulary, and they were ensuring that students have a really deep word depth knowledge. So we trained staff. A colleague of mine, Nikki Smith, she's leading on literacy with me. She's done a lot of training on the Freya model with staff, and actually it's really funny because a lot of staff were really keen to use the Freya model and sharing examples, and actually what looks like a really simple tool, some staff really struggled to get to grips with this, and some of the definitions they used to describe key terms became quite unwieldy for the students. So we had a long process of actually refining the Freya models. But as you can see in the background of this presentation, we've also allowed a lot of freedom for faculties to tackle vocabulary in their own ways, and we very early in the project we realised that actually each faculty is going to have its own way of doing things. Nikki Smith has just recently finished a train the trainer piece of CPD, so she's going to be rolling out the EEF Key Stage 3 training with all our middle level leaders. And as Stephen alluded to earlier, quite often in schools like my own, you do get high staff turnover. So where you think you think you've put lots of staff training in, quite 6 months later, it could be a different set of staff in front of you, and you've got to almost kind of develop a contingency plan for that to happen. So in training someone to do literacy our way, we can catch people on induction and make sure that they get the training so that they really embrace our culture as well. We do literacy in a very unique way in our school, and I think it's really important that staff coming into your school understand that way before we even ask them to teach in the classroom. So developing reading for pleasure has been a key driver for our school. We cleared out the decks in terms of everything that was filling up development plans, whole school, and we really only have a couple of key drivers. One of them's literacy, one of them's curriculum, and they obviously are interchangeable. But the key thing that I've been working on is just making sure that reading is visible. So you saw the picture of the library that we had earlier in the presentation. These are further images. It's quite bleak and depressing, as you can see. But over the last 2 years, we've spent, I think, in the region of £30,000 that the Trust Bright Futures has given us to make sure that we can provide a wide, rich resource library for our students. So this has taken a long time to develop, 2 years, like I say. And we've got, I think, in the region of 5,000 books in the library now. Our target is 7,000, but we're thinking of wacky ways to increase the number of books. So as you can see, we've really transformed the resource base, and that's something we are really proud of. The students can see a culture of reading straight away as soon as they walk in the building. So developing student leadership in terms of reading has been really important. We've trained a selection of student librarians that are kind of driving forward literacy, and we've been really proud of these students and their ownership of the literacy programme. In terms of struggling readers, we've had the literary canon in place for a year now, and that's yielded some incredible results. So all our form tutors read for 20 minutes every morning, and pretty much we've taken away any kind of admin or any attendance monitoring or anything like that from form tutors, so that they can purely focus on this kind of reading to the students. In kind of contrast to accelerated reader, where students are all reading their own book, our form of reading is more of a kind of direct instruction form of reading. We combine reciprocal read training with the reading of a selection of literary canon. All students read in mixed ability forms, and we found that some students read along. Quite a lot of the Stay 9-1 students, interestingly, they tend to just follow and listen. And originally in the project, we were worried about whether they were making progress with this. But I think the more I read about this kind of thing for Stay 9-1 students, the more I'm kind of happy with them just sitting and reading and listening. I feel like they're being immersed in the vocabulary, and that's good enough for me. But we realised that our struggling readers, our Stay 9-1 and 2 students, did need something completely different. And we are investigating DI at the moment. That's a program, an American program, direct instruction, that we're thinking of trialling with a small cohort of our Stay 9-1 and 2 students. We're also doing a guided read withdrawal from humanities subjects. So we've designed a programme of reading using the humanities content on a 6 to 7 weeks rolling programme. We are withdrawing students, completing a York baseline assessment. For those of you that don't know what that is, that's the York reading assessment. And we are teaching, I suppose, the humanities content, but through a reading lens. Now, we've spent a lot of time designing this programme using reciprocal read strategies, and unfortunately we've not quite had time to trial this because obviously schools are closed, but I've looked forward to seeing whether this programme works. It's very much homegrown, and the idea was that we withdrew them from humanities so that they don't lose out on the English, Maths, Science content, and they're not missing out on the humanities content either, because they are reading about the stuff that they should be learning about in that subject. Also for struggling readers, we've just designed a paired reading programme where our local sixth form, Blackpool sixth form, are sending years 12 students in to do one-to-one paired reading with our students as well.
Thanks everyone for attending this. Really do hope that you've got some key takeaways from this. So thank you very much, and look forward to you joining some of our future seminars.